Hi, and welcome to the Research Design and Analysis Core Seminar Series, which is offered as part of the UMass Boston Dana-Farber Harvard Cancer Center partnership to advance cancer health equity. Today, we're pleased to have Daniel Giovenco as our guest speaker. Dr. Giovenco is an assistant professor at the Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health, and he's also a member of the Columbia's Irving Comprehensive Cancer Center. His research is primarily focused on understanding the social and environmental determinants of tobacco use disparities. His work in this area is funded through an NIH Director's Early Independence Award, and Dr. Giovenco got his Ph.D. and MPH from the Rutgers School of Public Health. We're thrilled to have him speak today, and since this is a research design and analysis, sort of a method seminar series, I wanted to highlight what I think is particularly interesting as part of Dr. Giovenco and his collaborators' work, which is how they use several types of data together to kind of understand the social factors that influence tobacco use and may determine disparities in tobacco use behaviors. And in particular, the data sources they combine or use together to understand this, to understand the relationship between social factors in tobacco use and tobacco disparities are geographical information systems, or GIS, field data collection, where they actually go out to areas to collect data, as well as population surveys. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Giovenco to present his research.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for the opportunity to present. My name is Danny Giovenco. I'm an assistant professor at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health in the Department of Socio-Medical Sciences. And my research over the last several years has largely focused on tobacco use and tobacco use disparities. And occasionally when I'll talk to friends and family members, sometimes even public health and medical colleagues about the research that I do, I'll get the question sometimes, are people really still smoking anymore? Or how many people are actually still smoking? And I can see where people are coming from. Over the past several decades, we've made tremendous progress in reducing the overall rate of smoking. So back in the 1950s and 60s, when smoking was at its height in the US, the smoking rate was about 40%, and we've gotten that down to about 14% now. And that's largely attributed to public health programs and interventions, things like higher tobacco taxes, smoke-free air laws, improved access to cessation treatment programs. So we have made tremendous progress. But when I look at that 14%, that's just about where we are right now, it still blows my mind sometimes, because we've known for decades, for over 50, 60 years, how harmful smoking is, how deadly smoking can be. And still 14%, that's tens of millions Americans are still smoking. So although we have made progress and smoking has declined, the work is not finished yet. Also, that 14% masks a lot of the disparities and inequities that exist when it comes to tobacco use behaviors. So the national rate of smoking, again, is about 14% now, but rates are substantially higher among groups that have historically faced marginalization, discrimination, prejudice. So certain racial and ethnic minority groups have much higher rates of smoking. Those in lower socioeconomic classes, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals, and those with mental health disorders. For example, those with serious psychological distress, about 30% are current smokers. So these rates are much higher than the national rate conveys. What many people also don't think about when we talk about tobacco use is that we're not just talking about cigarette smoking anymore. Although cigarettes are still the most popular form of tobacco in the US, the marketplace is very diverse. So in addition to cigarettes, you very commonly see cigars and cigarillos available in retailers, smokeless tobacco products, and of course, e-cigarettes. In addition to things like hookah, which isn't pictured here. So there are many different kinds of tobacco products available in the marketplace, and some of them are very popular among certain subgroups. And I recognize that not everyone tuning in today might be familiar with some of these tobacco products. So I'd like to take a couple minutes just to go through each one. to add context to the presentation. So cigarettes, I'll skip. I think everyone probably knows what cigarettes are. Cigarillos are another popular form of tobacco on the market today, but these are not what you might think of when you think of traditional cigars. They're not the big Cuban cigars that maybe your grandparents or uncles or fathers smoked. These are smaller cigars. They're very, very cheap. So in many places around the country, you can get these cigars and these small cigars and cigarillos. You can get them for 99 cents, 2 for 99 cents, 3 for 99 cents. So they're very cheap. And unlike cigarettes, cigars and cigarillos are allowed to be sold in flavors. So it's not uncommon to find cigarillo products sold in fruity flavors and in candy flavors. I even saw a chicken and waffles flavor one time and pumpkin spice flavor. So really everything under the sun, you'll find those flavors in cigars. And we know that among young people, especially youth and young adults, cigarillos are used as blunts to smoke marijuana. So the user will slice open the cigarillo and dump out the tobacco filler inside, and roll marijuana inside the outer leaf and lick it and seal it shut. And they'll smoke it as a blunt, which we know carries a certain level of risk because that outer tobacco leaf or that outer wrap is made from tobacco. So in addition to inhaling marijuana smoke, the user is also being exposed to things like nicotine and some of the toxins and carcinogens that are in tobacco. So even though the filling is being dumped out, it doesn't really eliminate the risk of the tobacco product. Smokeless tobacco usually comes in round cans, and when many people think of smokeless tobacco, their mind goes to chewing tobacco. I always think of the movie The Sandlot, where the kids go to the carnival and they chew the tobacco and get sick to their stomach after riding the carnival ride. But actually, chewing tobacco is one of the least common forms of smokeless tobacco today. The most common form is moist snuff or dip. So these come in cans, and it kind of looks like coffee grounds, and the user will take a pinch of it and put it between their bottom lip and their gum line, and they'll absorb the nicotine transdermally. And with moist snuff, the user is required to spit out the saliva that kind of pools. But maybe a more refined type of smokeless tobacco is something called snus. This is very popular in Scandinavia. Actually, in some Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Norway, snus has overtaken cigarettes as the most common form of tobacco. So snus comes in a tea bag-like pouch. They're very small, and the user sticks it between usually their upper lip and their gum, and they absorb the nicotine that way. And with snus, the user does not need to spit. They could just kind of sit there. It can kind of sit there in their upper lip, and it's fairly discreet, and again, spit free. And tobacco companies are still coming out with new forms of tobacco, actually. A new addition to the marketplace in the last year or two are tobacco-free nicotine pouches. So these are similar to snus. They're kind of tea bag-like pouches, but they don't contain tobacco leaf. So somehow the nicotine was extracted from the tobacco, and they kind of just sit in these little powdery kind of pouches. So they claim to be tobacco-free, but the user is still absorbing nicotine through the gum line. And of course, something that we've heard a lot about over the past several years, e-cigarettes. During this presentation, I'll call them electronic nicotine delivery systems, the acronym ENDS, because I think that better encompasses the wide variety of styles that are available. And although these products come in many different shapes and sizes, they all essentially have the same mechanism of action. So they're battery operated devices that are sometimes rechargeable, sometimes disposable, but they heat a liquid solution to a point where the users can inhale the vapor. So there's no combustion involved. There's no fire or burning. The temperature just heats to a point where it can aerosolize or vaporize. And the e-liquid typically contains nicotine and other ingredients. And these products are rapidly evolving. Probably the best example, or the one that we're most familiar with, is Juul. Juul really took off among youth in particular over the last several years. So this is a type of ENDS product that's gotten a lot of focus among public health professionals recently. Now, although there are many different kinds of tobacco products on the market today, something that we need to recognize is that not all of these products carry the same level of risk. And the risk is largely differentiated by whether or not the products are combusted. So products that are burned with fire and inhaled typically release a lot more chemicals, expose the user to a lot more toxicants and carcinogens, things like carbon monoxide, tar, compared to non-combusted products. Now, that's not to say that non-combusted products aren't risky or are risk-free. They certainly are, but we have to acknowledge that these products do fall on a risk continuum. And there's now conclusive evidence that combusted tobacco users who completely switch to a non-combusted product substantially reduce their exposure to many of the toxicants present in things like cigarettes. So if you have someone who smokes cigarettes a pack a day who completely switches to a product like e-cigarettes, that person is engaging in something called tobacco harm reduction. And tobacco harm reduction is something that the field of tobacco control has really focused on heavily over the past several years. And the central premise of tobacco harm reduction is that all of those tobacco products that we talked about have one thing in common, and that is nicotine. And while we know that nicotine is very, very addictive, it's not what causes the cancer from tobacco use. It's not what causes the lung disease and even the heart disease. So nicotine typically keeps the user addicted to all of the other harmful things that tobacco has, like the carbon monoxide, the tar, the smoke, all the carcinogens. So the premise of harm reduction is that if a nicotine user migrates from a really risky combusted form to a non-combusted form, they're potentially lowering their exposure to toxicants and subsequently reducing health risks. And this is the concept behind things like nicotine replacement therapy, which are doctor prescribed. This gives the user the nicotine that their body is craving without exposure to all of the other harmful substances. Now, while tobacco harm reduction, I believe, presents an opportunity to reduce risk, it's certainly not our first recommendation if someone wants to quit using tobacco. Obviously, the most ideal situation is for someone to quit nicotine completely. But we know that that's extremely hard to do. I mean, think about the rates of tobacco use that we saw earlier. Nicotine is extremely difficult to quit, and many people face substantial barriers to doing so. So for those people who can't quit, who have tried for decades and just can't do it, or there are many people who don't want to stop using nicotine, if those users were to switch to a non-combusted or less risky form of tobacco, that could present an opportunity for harm reduction. So we need to consider the risk levels of different tobacco products. When we talk about tobacco use and tobacco use disparities today, we need to kind of consider the context of not only differences in risk level, but patterns of switching. So many tobacco users use multiple types of tobacco products, or they switch from one to the other. So our understanding of tobacco use disparities becomes a little more nuanced in today's very diverse product landscape. So much of my research focuses on epidemiological studies to monitor different tobacco use behaviors among population subgroups and assess what the implications might be on health disparities. So just to highlight one interesting example, let's talk about tobacco use behaviors between Black and white adults in the US. When you look at cigarette smoking, rates are about the same. It's about 15 to 16% between both groups. But things start to look a little different when we consider non-cigarette tobacco products. So with cigars, we know that cigar use is higher among Black adults in the US, just slightly higher. But this doesn't tell the full story. This kind of only paints an incomplete picture, because we know that among Black cigar users, the vast majority, about 95%, are using smaller cigars, things like cigarillos or little filtered cigars that resemble cigarettes. Use of those larger traditional cigars is more uncommon among Black cigar users. And this is important because those smaller cigars typically are inhaled, are typically used more frequently, which means potentially they contribute to higher levels of addiction. whereas the larger cigars are used much more infrequently, and often are not inhaled. When we compare that to cigar use among white adults in the US, about 1 in 4 are using those large cigars pretty infrequently. So there's some nuance here. And as we look at rates of tobacco use across the other types of products, we notice this pattern emerge where for combusted products, again, the more harmful products on that risk continuum, we see higher rates of use among Black adults compared to white adults. And this flips when we look at non-combusted products. So things like smokeless tobacco and e-cigarette use are higher among white adults than Black adults. And when we look at youth patterns of use, we see the same pattern, but it's a little bit more apparent. It's a little more visible, driven by higher rates of use overall. So over the last several years, a lot of my research has focused on understanding why we observe these differences. There's nothing natural about these differences. Something is driving them, and there may be dozens of factors that explain these patterns, but one thing that I think is a major driver of these patterns is that the way that these products are marketed in different communities and to different communities. It's no secret that the tobacco industry uses targeted marketing. They have for decades. Virginia Slims in the 60s and 70s were targeted to women. So we know that the tobacco industry has employed this strategy, and they continue to do so today. And that's true not just for cigarettes, but for non-cigarette types of tobacco products. So the cigar brand Swisher Sweets, this is the most popular cigar brand in the US. Their social media pages and even their websites are filled with imagery that use Black models and artists, and they even feature celebrity endorsers and influencers, people like Fetty Wap, Gucci Mane, Cardi B, pictured here. And Black & Mild, which is the second leading cigar brand in the US, pretty recently came out with 3 new flavors, jazz, rhythm, and blues, which are musical styles that were popularized by Black artists. So the cigar industry is now using these descriptors. These musical styles are a source of pride to the Black community. The cigar industry is now using this to continue selling addictive and potentially deadly products to that same community. And this contrasts with what e-cigarette and vaping targeted marketing looks like. So in the early days of Juul advertising, imagery would often feature younger white models. And even if you look at Juul's Instagram page, which actually no longer exists, they've taken it down, but you can see that the aesthetic is different here, that the target audience appears to be different. But one type of marketing that I believe, or that the field believes is more influential than any other, is marketing that occurs at the point of sale. And the reason why we believe it's so influential is because the tobacco industry spends a ton of money on it. So you know that it must work. So in 2018, the tobacco industry spent over $8 billion on advertising. That was the total advertising budget. And about 90% of those activities were things that occurred at the point of sale. So not just the physical advertisements that you see here, not just the shelf space, but this also includes things like couponing to lower prices to consumers. Sometimes the tobacco industry pays retailers incentives to lower the cost of tobacco products. So the industry focuses a lot of their marketing efforts here at the point of sale. So that's something that I focused on also over the past couple of years. But when we think about tobacco marketing at the point of sale and the research literature that exists around that, most of that, or most of what we know, is related to cigarettes. The way that non-cigarette tobacco products are marketed in communities at the point of sale is much less studied. So back in 2018, I launched the New York City Tobacco Marketing Surveillance Project, or Project ToMaS. And the goals of this project were to look at the ways that these products, these non-cigarette products, are marketed across New York City neighborhoods, and to examine how this promotion and this availability varies by neighborhood demographics. I think New York City is such a great place to study the impact of neighborhood characteristics on health. I mean, it's a city of neighborhoods. It's incredibly diverse. So I wanted to use New York City as this natural laboratory to study the ways that these products are promoted in communities. So at the time, New York City had over 8,000 tobacco retailers, and I would have loved to have visited them all, but we needed to use sampling in order to make this more feasible. So we geocoded all of the licensed tobacco retailers in the city's database, and we linked all of those dropped pins with their underlying neighborhood tabulation areas. So NTAs are administrative city districts that are aggregations of census tracts. So the borders very cleanly align with census tract boundaries. And neighborhood tabulation areas also, they kind of align with historic neighborhood definitions. So there's an NTA for the Upper West Side and Williamsburg, Brooklyn. So it's not perfect, but it is a good indication of historical neighborhoods as well. And there are 188 NTAs in New York City. So again, we linked all of those points with their underlying NTA, and we randomly sampled 10% of retailers from each neighborhood. And those are the retailers that we would visit in person for audits. So our final sample included almost 900 tobacco retailers. And this is what that looks like on a map. So this was a pretty massive effort that we completed over the course of the summer. And we had about 5 data collectors traveling to every single borough, every different neighborhood. And I'm pretty sure that we used every form of transportation that the city provides. We were riding city bikes around. We took ferries to Staten Island. We were riding the subway, buses, cars, taxis, you name it. And we completed this effort in about 4 months, something that we were very proud of. And before we went out to do this massive data collection effort, we thought very carefully about what we wanted to collect when we visited these stores. So one thing that we certainly wanted to measure were the physical advertisements. These are probably the most visible dimension of tobacco product marketing. So we captured advertising on store exteriors and store interiors. And we did this for 4 classes of tobacco products: cigarettes, cigars, smokeless tobacco, and vaping products, or ENDs. And we also assess product availability, because actually not every store carries cigars or vaping products. So we wanted to see if there were differences in availability as well. So we spent about, I'd say, 10 hours in the classroom training data collectors on how to capture ads. So we used a lot of example storefront images and trained data collectors how to identify ads. And we defined an ad as an industry-made sign that either had the product image or the logo. So in New York City, sometimes retailers will just handwrite things like e-cigarettes available here. So that would not count as an ad for this project. And we also counted ads that were larger than a standard index card, because there were some smaller ones, like little stickers on shelves, but we thought that the larger ads would be more visible and make potentially more of an impact on consumers. So we only captured the larger ads. So here are some examples of cigarette ads, and there's one e-cigarette ad here, blue. And these are also some of the images that we used during training. So the cigarette ads above the fresh fruit, and you can see how expensive packs of cigarettes are in New York City. Now the minimum is $13. So at the time, the $11.50 for Newport cigarettes was a steal for consumers. But now it's not unusual to see prices like $15, $16 for a pack of cigarettes. This is an example of the much cheaper Cigarillos, 2 for 99 cents, smokeless tobacco, and electronic cigarettes. So one of the most exciting parts of this project was the data collection instrument that we found and that we used. It really helped our efficiency in this pretty massive data collection effort. So the tool we used was called Fulcrum, and Fulcrum it was originally created for occupations like inspections and parcel delivery and utilities companies. They can, when they were in the field, they could capture data that has precise geocodes. But we found that it was very useful for our research efforts as well. So in Fulcrum, you just use drag and drop tools on the website, and you create your data collection instrument. And this actually pushes to your data collectors' phones. It's compatible with iOS and Android technology. So basically, we pre-geocoded all of the assigned retailers, and as you were walking through the field, so this is a screenshot on my cell phone, so you would actually see your little blue dot walking along, and you would know when you got to one of the stores, and when you did, you would tap on these pins, and it would open up the data collection form, and you would very quickly complete the instrument. You could even take pictures within the app. So it was very efficient. It all uploaded immediately to the cloud. So this was a phenomenal tool, and I'm happy to take questions about this at the end of the presentation if you want to email me if you want to learn more about this app, because it was tremendously helpful for us. So for our data analysis, initially we just wanted descriptive statistics. How prevalent is advertising for these products? How available are they? And more importantly, we wanted to see if there were differences by neighborhood demographics. So because NTAs were groups of census tracts, we could really precisely calculate the demographics and different socioeconomic characteristics of those neighborhoods. So in the published paper, or in the paper that we published based on this study, we used multi-level models. This accounted for the fact that retailers were nested or clustered within neighborhoods. So we used multi-level modeling to estimate adjusted prevalence ratios. And we were interested in things like racial and ethnic composition of neighborhoods, median household income, percentage of youth residents that live there. But in today's presentation, I'll actually present just more descriptive data. I actually think the descriptive statistics do a better job at telling the story and highlighting patterns that we saw. So first, when it comes to product advertising, we found that smokeless tobacco was very infrequently advertised. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there aren't many smokeless tobacco users in a place like New York City, but cigars and ends were advertised in about 1 in 5 stores. E-cigarettes or vaping products were advertised in about 1 in 4 stores. But when it comes to these two products, there were differences in the types of communities where we found this advertising. So let me break down this graph a little bit. It's sort of complex, but the variables on the x-axis are several key variables that we were interested in. So the percentage of non-Hispanic Black residents in a neighborhood, Hispanic residents, non-Hispanic white residents, median household income, and percentage of youth residents. So initially, when we were just doing our preliminary analyses, we grouped each of the 188 neighborhoods into tertiles, low, medium, or high categories for each of these variables. So in this graph, the height of the bar represents the percentage of retailers in those types of neighborhoods that advertise cigars. So if we use non-Hispanic Black residents as an example, in neighborhoods with the highest percentage of non-Hispanic Black residents, so in that top third, about 32% of retailers in those neighborhoods advertise cigar products. And this was a significant increasing trend. And we saw that the reverse was true when it came to non-Hispanic white residents. So in neighborhoods with a large proportion, with the largest proportion of non-Hispanic white residents, cigar advertising was uncommon, and this was a significant decreasing trend. We also saw the same trend by income level. So in high income neighborhoods, cigar advertising was less prevalent than in the lowest income neighborhoods. For smokeless tobacco, prevalence, again, was lower overall, but we actually saw the reverse trends. So in largely Black neighborhoods, we found that smokeless advertising was very uncommon. Whereas if you look at percent white, we saw an increasing trend. So largely white neighborhoods had more smokeless tobacco advertising. Higher income neighborhoods actually had smokeless tobacco advertising. In neighborhoods with a large percentage of youth, there was a lower percentage of smokeless advertising. And when we look at vaping products, we see those same exact trends as we did for smokeless, just more apparent because ends advertising was generally more prevalent. So then we looked at product availability separately. And when we looked at cigar availability, we were particularly interested in 99-cent cigars. In New York City, at that time, these were by far the most inexpensive tobacco product available. when you compare it to $13 packs of cigarettes, 99 cents for cigars is incredibly inexpensive. So we particularly focused on those types of cigars. And what we found is that about half of stores carried these inexpensive cigars and almost half carried vaping products. But, and this is kind of what we expected, there were differences based on neighborhood demographics. And these mirror, I'll go through them quickly because they really mirrored what we saw for advertising. So when it came to 99-cent cigar availability, they were very accessible in largely Black neighborhoods. So in the highest third of neighborhoods, based on percentage of Black residents, about 70% of retailers carry these inexpensive cigars. We also saw that availability was higher in largely Hispanic or Latino neighborhoods. The opposite was true for largely white neighborhoods and high-income neighborhoods. For smokeless tobacco, again, lower availability overall, but we see a reversal in those patterns. And for vaping product availability, we saw that vaping products were most accessible in largely white neighborhoods. So the neighborhoods in New York City that have the highest percentage of white residents, in those neighborhoods, almost 70% of retailers carried ENDS products. And products were less accessible in largely Black neighborhoods, largely Hispanic Latino neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods. So this is, this is meaningful. The fact that there's differential, not only is there differential availability, but it's differential availability of products that differ in risk. So some of the lower risk products, like vaping products, like smokeless tobacco, are generally more accessible and marketed more in largely white, high-income neighborhoods, whereas more risky products, inexpensive cigarillos, as an example, are more accessible in largely Black, largely Hispanic Latino neighborhoods. This is problematic that we see these trends based on the risk differences that we know exist. So we saw patterns statistically, but we also saw them geographically. And I think this is where the data really come to life. So the darkest red color on this map are neighborhoods in which 75% or more retailers carried 99-cent cigars and cigarillos. So we see evidence of spatial clustering in places like the South Bronx. This is Harlem and other parts of northern Manhattan. This is Jamaica, Queens. This is Brownsville, Brooklyn. So these are largely Black neighborhoods where cigarillo availability is also highest. When we look at the availability of smokeless tobacco, we see almost an exact juxtaposition. Again, lower availability overall, but it's difficult to find things like smokeless tobacco and even vaping products in neighborhoods like the South Bronx, northern Manhattan, Brownsville, Brooklyn. Vaping products are much more likely to be available in places like the Upper East Side of Manhattan, the financial district, certain parts of Brooklyn, Staten Island, the more suburban outskirts of Queens and Brooklyn. And these are just some example images that we took in the field, some illustrative examples. In Jamaica, Queens, we saw a cigar advertisement advertising $1.50 cigars. And in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, if anyone has been to Williamsburg or who knows something about it, it's an interesting place. There's a big hipster culture. So typically what you see in Williamsburg won't be representative of what you might see in other places, but we saw a ton of snus in Williamsburg. And in one store, we even saw a pamphlet placed next to the snus case talking about smokeless tobacco as a form of harm reduction. It's actually not legal for groups to do this, to place this kind of information next to tobacco products, but nevertheless, we saw it, and it's something that we didn't see in other parts of the city. So we concluded that there were very observable differences in the way that tobacco products are marketed across New York City neighborhoods, and this was related to also the level of risk that these products carried. And sometimes people ask, well, doesn't this just reflect supply and demand? So if people, among certain groups or in certain neighborhoods are more likely to use products like cigarillos or ENDS, yeah, they'll be carried in stores more, or they'll be more advertised. It's just reflecting supply and demand. And I think that's absolutely true, but with that mentality, you're really only thinking about current users. So you're not thinking about people who aren't users, who are still being exposed to these products and this advertising. So people like never users or youth. Exposure to these ads may actually increase the likelihood that these people will start to use products. It's also not considering former users. So if someone who quit using some of these products is constantly exposed to marketing or advertising availability, that might make them more likely to relapse. There's also current users who, yeah, this relationship might be supply and demand, but these current users may want to quit and have more difficulty doing so when they're constantly exposed to promotions and couponing and advertisements. So what is a potential solution to this? I think that a promising strategy is to regulate products based on risk level. So the fact that cigars and cigarillos, some of the most harmful products on that risk continuum, are available for 99 cents is unacceptable. I think that we should use a risk-based regulatory strategy or policy strategy to make sure that we're more strictly regulating the most harmful products, especially when these products, there's evidence that they're more heavily marketed in low-income neighborhoods with higher proportions of racial and ethnic minority residents. And lastly, I just want to highlight a study that we did based on this neighborhood level ecological data that we collected, because I think identifying neighborhood patterns and trends is really important, but the real value of that data is when you can somehow link it with behavioral data. So we were very fortunate to have partnered with the New York City Department of Health, who provided us access to geocoded survey data from the New York City Community Health Survey. This is an annual telephone survey of about 10,000 New York City residents, and their XY geographic coordinates for their place of residence is available with a data use agreement. So we actually linked our neighborhood level data with that geocoded survey data. So each respondent in the sample was assigned the tobacco retail characteristics of their neighborhood. So we were able to examine associations between potential exposures and individual level behaviors. So two questions that we had. The first one maybe is the most obvious one. Is tobacco advertising in neighborhoods associated with tobacco use, period? We expected that it would be. Unfortunately, the only variable that we were able to look at in this data set was cigarette smoking. There was an e-cigarette use variable, but the sample size was very small and it would have prohibited stable analyses. So first we asked, is neighborhood advertising level associated with cigarette smoking? And we also wanted to take this one step further and see if there was any evidence of effect modification. So does this relationship between exposure and tobacco use differ based on demographic characteristics or other factors? Are there certain groups that maybe are more susceptible to this advertising? So we again used multi-level modeling, which accounted for the fact that individuals were nested within neighborhoods. And we used multi-level modeling to estimate the adjusted odds of whether someone was a current smoker by different sociodemographic characteristics. There was a variable related to current depression that we examined, and obviously cigarette advertising in neighborhoods divided into quartiles. And then we test the interactions to see if effect modification was present. So I want to highlight probably our most substantial or our most noteworthy finding. We found that overall, cigarette smoking was most prevalent among adults with current depression in the sample. So about 1 in 4 individuals with current depression was a current cigarette smoker, compared to only about 12% among those without depression. And this was significant in adjusted analyses. What was most surprising to us is we found that there was no relationship between cigarette advertising and current smoking behaviors. And we thought that we were so confused, thinking, everything we know about the impact of tobacco advertising is wrong. There's absolutely no correlation. What we thought might explain this is that New York City has very strong tobacco control policies. Again, cigarette smoking or cigarette packs are typically sold for about $14 or $15. And there's also other types of really strong progressive tobacco control policies in New York City that might kind of mitigate the effect of advertising. So we thought that that might explain it. But when we did our test for interaction to see if certain groups maybe were more susceptible to this type of advertising, we did find one significant result, and that was based on current depression status. So in stratified analyses, we looked at the association between advertising exposure and cigarette smoking among adults without depression. So that's the blue dots on the bottom. And we found no evidence of an association. But when we looked at, or when we ran this analysis among individuals with depression, we did see some significant differences. So generally, in neighborhoods with higher levels of cigarette advertising, individuals had or were more likely had higher odds of being cigarette smokers. The quartile 3 neighborhoods were the exception. So this didn't follow necessarily a dose response relationship. And we don't exactly know what's going on with the quartile 3 neighborhoods. These neighborhoods did have a pretty low sample size of respondents, so that might have impacted the findings. Or maybe there's just something unique about these neighborhoods that we didn't capture. Maybe there's certain types of institutions in those neighborhoods that affected the findings. We don't know for sure, but we did find evidence of this interaction where higher advertising levels was associated with increased odds of use among those with depression. So our takeaway was that it's possible that this retail advertising might serve as a cue to smoke among adults with depression, and this corroborates some of the laboratory studies that show that cue-induced urges to smoke are stronger among those with depressive symptoms. So in laboratory testing, individuals with current depression were exposed to advertising, and their urge to smoke or their craving level was measured, and this was found to be higher compared to smokers without depression. So this kind of corroborates some of those lab-based studies. And the potential implications is that when clinicians or other treatment providers are working with someone who has current depression or perhaps even other types of mental illness, we may need to more purposely discuss things like the impact of marketing exposure when people are moving around throughout the day, and how that might serve as a potential trigger and how to cope with that. We also believe that any efforts to restrict marketing practices in the retail environment, like counter marketing campaigns or advertising bans, may particularly benefit individuals with current depression and perhaps even other types of mental illness. So I want to thank you for tuning in and for your attention. I wish we were together in person for this, and I wish we could interact a little bit more. But if you do have questions about the presentation or anything else that I talked about, please feel free to send me an email, and I will gladly answer. So thank you very much, and hope to see you in person one day.